Good evening, everyone. I'm Tracy Glab, the Executive Director of the Flint Institute of Arts, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the preview of the exhibition American Realism, Visions of America, 1900 to 1950, which opens to the public tomorrow and is on view through the rest of the year to December 30th. American Realism draws from the collections of the Flint Institute of Arts, Muskegon Museum of Art, the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts. Those three museums, we actually collaborated on a show, and the lead curator from Muskegon's here tonight, Art Martin, and he worked with our curators Rachel Holstag and Sarah Cohn to put this together. And along with loans from those three museums, we have special loans from the Detroit Institute of Arts, Arts Bridges, and several local private collectors from Flint are here tonight, and I want to thank them especially for making this exhibition just special by adding their loans. Thank you so much. Yes. The exhibition highlights paintings, works on paper, and sculpture from the first half of the 20th century, when the American art scene underwent significant transformation. And it's really going to be a treat for you tonight. So now some thank yous. I would like to first thank the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation for their continued support, which is so deeply appreciated at the FIA and very vital to us continuing these programs. I also want to thank the citizens of Genesee County for demonstrating their support of our programs by means of the Genesee County Arts Education and Cultural Enrichment Millage, which provides free entry to Genesee County residents every day of the week. And of course, a big thank you to Huntington Bank for sponsoring Huntington Free Saturdays, which allows everyone beyond our county free entry to the galleries on Saturdays. Thank you. Thank you, Huntington. It's the fall season now. We're getting out our sweaters and apple cider, pumpkin spice lattes. Let's not forget football. And also, it's the beginning of our FOMA film series. It starts tonight with Lemoncita films for your refresh your memory are every Friday and Saturday at 7:30 p.m. and Sundays at 2 p.m. So please check it out. There's a film schedule you can pick up on the way out. For those of you interested in glass, you won't want to miss our upcoming flame-wicking demonstration and Q&A with glass artist Bishop Randall. He made the piece that you see on the screen there. The demos are going to be on Saturday and Sunday, September 16th and 17th. Those are free to the public, thanks to McLaren Healthcare. And the Q&A will be on at 3:30 on Saturday, and it will be with also another fellow artist, Drew Cupp, so you won't want to miss that. We also have a Come-Ready family lecture on September 21st at 6 p.m. by Dr. Catherine Kasdorf, who's curator of Arts of Asia and the Islamic World at the Detroit Institute of Arts. Her presentation will explore the visual intricacies of temples in South India. Again, that is free of charge, thanks to the Come-Ready family. Thank you. Yeah, awesome. There's a members-only Thompson lecture, so you can never complain that you don't have anything to do in Flint or at the FIA. On October 10th at 6 p.m. by Dr. Aaron Rosen in conversation with the artist Michael Takeo Magruder, they're going to be talking about artificial intelligence, so you won't want to miss that. It's going to be pretty interesting. And then you can tell all your friends the cutting-edge things going on in the art world. Lastly, not leastly, we have the 14th annual Art on Tap beer, bourbon, and barbecue event on October lucky Friday the 13th. Details can be found and tickets can be purchased on our website. Thank you for bearing with me for all of those public service announcements. So please now take a moment to silence your cell phones because you're all here for our special guest. Tonight, we have Dr. Carmenita Higginbotham, who will present New Realities, Heightened Realism and Urban American Art in the 1930s. Dr. Higginbotham is an art historian whose research examines 20th century American art. Presently, Higginbotham is Dean of Virginia Commonwealth University's School of the Arts. Prior, she was department chair and assistant and associate professor in the departments of Art and American Studies. She received her PhD in the history of art from our very own University of Michigan. Go Blue. Sorry, Spartans, if you have any Spartans in the audience. Please join me in giving a warm Flint welcome to Dr. Carmenita Higginbotham.
Go Blue. I will have to say I was born in East Lansing. My mother was at Michigan State, so go green as well. It's in the blood. It's in the blood. Thank you so very much for the warm welcome and for hosting me this evening. I am in Virginia. As was mentioned, I am at Virginia Commonwealth University, and I was 15 years at the University of Virginia, and it is very hot there. And so it was nice to leave 100-degree weather to come to Flint and enjoy this moment. These talks never happen in a bubble, and I want to thank the various individuals at the museum for their attention and care. Sarah Cohn, Rachel Holsteg, Emily Legleitner, Craig Fenner, who takes care of the AV and all the technician needs in that. These events will not happen without these individuals. And then, of course, Tracy Glab. A small anecdote, as we reconnected when I arrived to give this talk, Tracy Glab was an individual who, while I was a PhD student at the University of Michigan, approached me and actually is the reason why I published my very first piece on Reginald Marsh so many years ago. And she took a chance on a graduate student who had some fresh and interesting things to say about Reginald Marsh. And from there, just that publication, it became a chapter of my book, and it helped, one of the things that really caused my career to take off. So thank you so much, Tracy. Thank you. Oh, the clicker. Yes. See, Craig, thank you, Craig. This talk would have been very different without this. All right. In the early to mid-1930s, New York City, an overarching symbol of national progress, a primary site for America's economic and social advancement, and the decided repository of the country's artistic legacy, was under fire. Very little seemed to be right with the city, and by extension, urban culture, whose indelible impact on the rest of the country could scarcely be measured. Cautious supporters of city life were quick to identify New York as the mirror in which contemporary America saw itself. Detractors of the city were a bit less kind. According to the popular journal Scribner magazine in 1931, urban centers like New York maintained varied and prevalent characteristics. These included, quote, its graft, its crime, its dirt, its accents, its utilitarian ugliness, its opportunistic cheapness, its parvenu swank, its swelling army of epicene, even its philosophy of toleration, which is less a virtue than a confession of weakness, a lack of a way of life. It's harsh. Most critics agreed that the scale to which the experiential realities of city life had altered traditional social structures should be of continued concern. For some, these changes were thrilling. For others, they remained mildly worrisome. And for others still, including artists, it was an upheaval, a wholly unbearable byproduct of the 20th century. It is in this moment of societal reflection that the regionalist painter Thomas Hart Benton, before he became a stalwart regionalist, resolved to remove himself from the whole of the urban scene. In 1935, and during the thick of the Depression, Benton complained to the paper, the New York Sun, that the city, quote, had lost its dynamic quality, end quote. He wrote, "On the upswing, New York is grand when it is building buildings, tearing down buildings, making and spending money. But when it's on the downswing, it gets feeble and queerless and touchy. The place has lost all masculinity." We can, in part, forgive Benton for his testy, albeit breathtakingly chauvinistic, denunciation of New York. The American scene, the 1930s realist art movement with which his imagery was affiliated, had splintered just a few years before. In this period, the movement sought to employ pictorial realism to picture everyday experience and cultivate a dominant American aesthetic. One cluster of artists, later labeled regionalists, retreated to the Midwest to paint rural subject matter in an effort to represent the heroics of individualism and to celebrate a national nostalgia in a manner both productive and patriotic. Another set of artists preferred source material drawn from the cityscape in order to arrive at an authentic or real vision of contemporary culture, as they featured urbanism, industrialism, and spectacle as truly indicative of the United States. Yet, to return to Benton, we can consider his statement an important touchstone to understanding American realism's negotiation of the city, gender, and though not explicitly stated, race. There are two imperative trends that ground my talk this evening. First, that the concept of the city-oriented realist art production through the 1930s in the United States. The city existed as a key aesthetic, and I contend a social fault line in determining the future of American art. And second, again, interpretive trends, that realist imagery of this period situated gender and race as important pictorial fulcrums, and the presentation of masculinity and whiteness and their maintenance underpinned much of the work of the Depression era. Now, there is a lot of different types of work in my talk today, but much of it very often will focus and return to a set of artists known loosely as the 14th Street Group. It's a way to sort of corral just the breadth and depth of images that you see in the exhibition, but also of the work that's being produced at this time. The 14th Street Group is from New York and centered around Manhattan's Union Square, for any of you that have been there. But please, I want, at least the images that I show and the comments that I make, to really be considered a foundation, a compelling paradigm for us to adopt new interpretive ways and lenses to understand 1930s realist art. Now for an assertion. Scholars love to do this. So now for an assertion. The growth and cultural prominence of cities altered the aesthetic parameters of American realism. Many of the artists that chose to remain in urban centers in the 1930s witnessed firsthand a melange of individuals that lived and worked in public life. Urban identity was defined by the presence of the body as city residents navigated bustling streets and crowded subways, equally as much as they participated in popular amusements and public protests. The dramatic population increases in American urban centers such as New York, Chicago, St. Louis, and Detroit triggered cultural transformations and prompted series of debates about resolving a range of urban dilemmas, many of which centered around relations between city residents. More tangible concerns involving mass transit and vehicular and pedestrian traffic were balanced with sociological considerations that debated the rise of community apathy and the inevitable clashes between diverse groups occupying the same bustling cityscape were inevitable. What critics identified as most troubling about New York and cities like it was precisely what fueled artists and their quest for authentic subject matter. And I'm going to bounce back real quick so we can just look at just a little bit more of the city. Incidents of contact and conflict between residents were visually accessible, appealing to and challenging the variety of aesthetic interests for Depression-era artists. The painter Raphael Sawyer, for example, had left the National Academy of Design as he acknowledged that his new school became the streets of New York, and he opted to wander all over the city from east to west with his sketchbook and pencil in hand. Sawyer, like others, looked to the various episodes on the landscape, the bums lounging in public against public sculpture, the lunching office women engaged in intimate conversation, the middle and working class shoppers who weaved in and out of retail establishments to distinguish urban culture, and importantly, the urban body in pictorial terms. Now we're going to look back. A few decades earlier, this was not the case. The reigning realist painters and illustrators at the turn of the century, known as the Ashcan Group, clung to the landscape of the city as constitutive of a national and urban art. The group's de facto leader, Robert Henry, dovetailed the physical city as subject into his advocacy with an aesthetic dedicated to contemporary realism. The placement of value on direct visual experience, which he applied to both the artist's pursuit of subject matter and the technique in which the subject was represented, was dominant in his work. Henry bade students to, quote, forget about art. Paint pictures of what interests you in life. Paint with emotion, not sentimentality. Paint with honesty, not cleverness, end quote. For the artist, John Sloan, along with Henry, who found a mentor in Henry, this often translated into a concerted merging of building and figure, of industry and humanity. The theme of public transportation, as you see here, also offered an appropriate reconciliation of these aspects of industry and humanity. After all, mass transit was as transformative to the city's visual landscape as it was to concepts of mobility, physical and social, in modern life. People began to traverse the city and to pursue greater opportunities than were previously known by them. As we see in paintings by Ashcan artists, and as we see in paintings here, the physical terrain of the city with its elevated trains and storefronts, its motor cars and electric lights were required in order to mark modernity. Sharp diagonals imaged by John Sloan in his 6th Avenue and 30th Street, for example, structure vistas of technological advancement and architectural sprawl that pointedly accommodate the working classes, framing, squeezing, pushing them through the city. Appearing less as agents and more as circumstances of the cityscape, pictured figures integrate into the urban landscape and further acquiesce to the environment around them and to the dominant surveying eye of the viewer and artist. As an approach to depicting the urban scene, a number of 1930s artists, readily adapted Henry's cry for immediacy and authenticity, and further focused attention on the body. Kenneth Hayes Miller, for example, valued Henry's promotion of the city as both a thematic resource for contemporary art and an experiential necessity for the modern artist. Miller was a founding member of the 14th Street School or group, depending on how you want to view them. They were not an official school, even though art historians later gave them that title. This would be a cadre of Manhattan-based artists who identified Union Square on the Lower East Side of the city to provide the appropriate mix of working class bodies, racial and ethnic diversity, and visual spectacle. All of these things they found in this neighborhood. And in city spaces, the Union Square became a microcosm for them of the city overall. City spaces that seemed nearly common because of their ubiquity. For Miller, Henry had identified the essence of contemporary realism. Yet Miller also sought to accommodate the ways in which processes of vision and visibility increasingly shaped the manner urban artists sought to occupy, respond to, and inevitably claim urban space. With art and experience allied, the need to privilege the artistic eye that in turn affirmed the authority of the artist's interpretation would be de-emphasized. Even further, being a realist painter who selected city life as a theme, this did not necessarily legitimate the work as truly urban art. So this is a moment in which the definition of an urban artist, again, is being raised and debated. A reliance on capturing the city through the gaze also left city painters to acknowledge that increasingly savvy audiences had their own processes of urban vision that could confirm, deny, work in tandem with, or oppose specific artistic interpretations. The influences of film and of illustration, as two examples, had increased the ability of audiences to read imagery. As such, it left them better equipped to negotiate processes of realism important to the history of American art, and to advocate for visual facts that could reach and could speak to underlying truths in contemporary life. For urban artists like the 14th Street Group, the application of formal techniques that emphasized coherent structured design was as important as addressing the urban crowd's transformation of New York's visual. The result would be the triumph of visual order over diversity, and by this I mean diversity of all kinds, particularly bodily diversity. This unfolds in various images of Union Square, as we arrive at a sense of the dominating visual components that mark the representation of the square, but most importantly, the representation of the city through bodies in the 1930s. Very often with the 14th Street School, frieze-like compositions place in direct relation the figures that occupy the foreground of the painting and the architectural elements that at times frame the activity, all while subduing the image's seeming randomness. And this is one of the elements that I truly love about Reginald Marsh. I will always go back to Marsh, which he is featured here in the lower right quadrant here, that he is always committed to order even within chaos. This is so much part of the 14th Street School. This arrangement of figures is self-consciously democratic, as physiognomic variation and distinctive costuming gives way to a visual coherence. Consider the urban scenes of Edward Lanning and Isabel Bishop. Unnaturalistic blues and pinks in Lanning's palette draw attention to the balanced construction of the scene, the pristine city without evocation of its purported ills, in that wonderful quote from the beginning. Lanning, who was most faithful to Miller's teachings, had escaped what Reginald Marsh described as, quote, the spellbinding attractions of bewitching boudoir painters of the Saint-Cézanne regiments of the National Academy banalities. And this is very much in reaction to the push in sort of modern European influences in American art. He also described Lanning pulling away from the, quote, aerial Stieglitz acrobats. Instead, Lanning shows us that there is a world of real people, both male and female, flesh, blood, elbows, facial expressions, unbroken necks. And that's such an interesting detail. Unbroken necks, what is he expecting? Lanning city scene, depleted of a sensory cacophony of sight and sound that competes for the attentions of urban audiences, is transformed into a visual feast of color and form in homage to the artistic virtuosity of the Italian Renaissance. Bishop's painting, with its thoughtful reference to the figures of Dante and Virgil, relies more heavily on Union Square landmarks to create a pictorial idea of geometric balance and a means to emphasize its own construction. Looming buildings dwarf a gathered crowd that appears as prosperous members of the middle class rather than the working class and poor that frequented the square in actuality. Still, the expectation that urban representation be gritty breaks through as Bishop loosens her brush ever so slightly, which allows for a less finished visual reality, an evocation of the city with continued reference to the Renaissance. In the Depression era, the city was transformed or situated as both a place at which individuals arrive and a site of urban experience in which encounters between figures led to the exploration of latent pleasures of participation. The gaze of the viewer, inserted for the eye of the artist, weaves through crowded scenes. This is one of the exciting things about urban art of this period. For a number of urban artists, it is not necessary to record. Rather, it's required that both artist and audience be present, confronting, accessing, accepting a complicity in the construction of urban space. The city exists at street level. Lowered sight lines that obscure architectural forms and bust-length and half-body figures further resembled instituted techniques in popular culture, including classic Hollywood, and those representations in cinema, that by the mid-30s heightened the psychological investments of frequent and wary moviegoers. Close-ups that isolated figures and cross-cutting techniques that compressed time that were found in film work in tandem with visual arts' use of overlapping forms and tight compositional space to distill the visual experience into quick, focused moments that mirror modern urban life. And the looking and aesthetic practices here are crossing so freely over popular culture. Still, always a still, art historians love a still, urban audiences often worked in a narrow range of subject matter, with an awareness that their aesthetic balanced previous articulations were always going to be of issue. This would include working class subject matter that was nearly required of the American realist artist of the city. It was believed that laborers and even the poor were without affectation, and their representation stressed and the maintained an appropriate amount of humility. This had precedent in socially progressive photography of the 1880s and 90s, as we see with works here by Jacob Riis. Here, the starkness of light and dark tones, achieved through a crisp photographic style, captures visceral sensory detail, always important that it's visceral, to spectacularize stained low-hanging ceilings and cracked walls. Meanwhile, bewildered expressions of disheveled figures left subjects defenseless against the curious gazes of middle-class readers and viewers, reformers, and social activists. Now, in comparison, 1930s artists created contemporary figures, bodies remarkable for their ubiquity, as opposed to these which seem to be singled out and individualized. And again, remarkable for their ubiquity in the 1930s, with the cityscape rather than them being exceptional or exceptional to it. In order to understand what was urban and the manner by which one was to look at and thus interpret the city was to realize that these bodies were everywhere. The identification of the type of body, routinely working class, and now I'm going to insert race, often white, was essential, creating these types. Working class subjects dominated as images of shopping districts, of subways, of Coney Island and Union Square, if you're in New York, proliferated, regardless of stylistic differences. This is all throughout the 1930s. In Reginald Marsh's paintings, for example, the fluidity of social boundaries that mark the 30s play out amongst bodies that press, push, and jostle for space in the cityscape. Rather than a statement about which person or group or individuals will persevere, the spectacle of their struggle, displaced and visualized in the work as a concerted pursuit of pleasure, is what fuels Marsh's imagery. For Pip and Flip, the artist creates a disconcerting jumble of figures that, I love the word jostle because that's the best way to describe Marsh, jostle before vibrant posters and bright lights in a dizzying, potent mix that conflates reading advertisements of promised performances with looking at Coney Island revelers, another spectacle that is fully realized in his work. The distance between viewer and various spectacle now narrows, even as it expands, and it nearly undulates. There is so much activity in the color and the staging of this particular work. Text and spectacle invites us to read, just as its linear format and its full-length bodies continue to push us away and create a distance. There's always this in and out with Marsh. Marsh's images consistently reminded viewers that stability, social, cultural, visual, cannot be guaranteed in the 1930s in the urban scene. In the work The Bowl from 1933, precariously arranged bodies defy restraint as figures appear to squeeze and stack atop one another to spill out of the composition. The emphasis on the dramatic tilt of the carnival ride, known as the whirlaway, forces writers to randomly crash into one another. And his evocation of this creates an oblique viewing angle, or he creates one for this, that includes the spectator of the painting, who is as off-kilter as the pictured figures, as a Coney Island participant. Marsh avoids pictorial order for the pleasures and hazards of social subversion. This celebration of the city's lower element was at odds with Marsh's own upbringing in an affluent East Coast family, and later a regimented education, which he enjoyed in Renaissance art. He was a student of Henry's, but also was very close to, obviously, members of the 14th Street School. He practiced draftsmanship, which is a key part of his work, and traditional painting techniques that he learned while an art student at Yale University. There was always this disconnect, and often with a number of urban artists of this period. They are not from these spaces of the city, yet they are just spectators, enjoying these pleasures. As much as Marsh's work visualizes a literal compression of the urban environment that opposes visual and social boundaries, Miller and Miller's street vignettes, in comparison, offer careful reaffirmations of them. Renaissance-inspired visual references within his paintings work both to elevate and contain subjects dominant in the contemporary urbanscape. Marsh is more subtle about it, but Miller is invested in controlling it as much as possible. Sculpted, overlapping figures that repeat in the bodies of the male wanderer, the middle class shopper, the immigrant mother. These are all prominent types that he privileges, and the city sophisticate compete for visual and physical space as much as they co-occupy them. Miller may celebrate how the working classes and poor embodied an authenticity of expression. Still, differences existed between the trained eye and hand of the artist and the distracted vision belonging to the masses. Marsh attempts to collapse those. It's Miller who wants to emphasize there is a difference in looking and in training of the artist as opposed to the masses that enjoy the cityscape. Miller's imagery attests that the appropriate expression of affectation in the urban art should be conveyed through and celebrated in the artist and his training and concerted stylistic expression, through emphases on composition, through a commitment to form, and the use of a medium, often a tempera, that Miller at least deemed to be the direct application and use of and translation of classical principles. Now, such gestures that merge classicism and contemporary culture, however, face the challenge of more current social historical circumstances. Artists could not help but recognize the manner by which social and cultural diversity altered how the cityscape appeared. Women, as a prime example of such change, entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers in the 1930s, and the small measure of economic autonomy they achieved reoriented their personal priorities. A desire to participate in public activities often competed with commitments to marriage, homemaking, and child rearing. Single urban women instead exploited new social freedoms that altered their mannerisms, their dress, their speech, their interactions with the members of the opposite sex. This, in turn, escalated gendered looking practices immediately bound to the space of the city and reinforced by culturally influential industries such as fashion and journalism and other systems of visual representation. With everyone engaged in looking and nearly every component of the landscape open to urban gazes, activities that are coded, and I will emphasize coded as particularly gendered and particularly racial, like girl watching, like slumming, naturalize the appearance of disparate groups on the cityscape, while concurrently asserting the primacy of the normative white male gaze. And activities like girl watching and slumming only can take place with the white male gaze being activated. That is what is appearing in these images, often of difference, by white artists of the diversity of the city. New trends developed to present more democratic representations of women, even as the imagery seemed to upend more traditional heteronormative presentations. This included the introducing of the young, white, working-class female type, contemporary in style and sentiment, and inspired by new workers flooding office buildings and retail shops. We see this in the work of Isabel Bishop. Bishop had been a student at the Art Students League in New York. Early in her career, she favored classicizing impulses, but as her work matured with influences drawn from contemporary urban culture, her commitment to grafting formal principles from the Renaissance onto contemporary subject matter waned. Defined by their participation in the urban environment rather than by their sexuality, Bishop's office workers dominate urban spaces. The city has faded away into shallow, undefined settings as careful modeling and soft chiaroscuro offer fully realized forms that appear psychologically complex through their pictured self-involvement or their focused interaction with other women. These female workers, or office girls, act as the new woman of the 1930s, carrying the bearing of social independence and without need of the gaze of the viewer, again often crafted in this period as male and white, to activate their presence. The undefined spaces provided to Bishop's office girls further emphasize their social fluidity as employed working-class women. So they are not bound to the landscape, they're not bound to their jobs, they are truly independent and on their own. Pictorially, Bishop's interest in female office workers would find a counterpart, as if all roads go back to Reginald Marsh, which they probably do, would find a counterpart in, you guessed it, Reginald Marsh's, who knew, fascination with buxom women, and Miller's physically robust shoppers, who draw attention to the ways in which the city spaces accommodate the female body that negotiates vision and visuality. And this is a key difference from Bishop. Marsh was most explicit, if not faithful, to the new feminine ideal that had taken hold in popular culture in the 1930s. This would be the figure of the siren. As a smart-talking and street-savvy feminine ideal, the siren exemplified sexual freedom and the thrill of transgressive behavior for which the city was known. Delighting in her less than affluent background, the siren's glowing pale skin, flowing hair, and body demeanor served as one of the period's reactive characters, a model of urbanity whose intelligence never slept, who could never be fooled, and whose split-second reaction to the acts or word of another led her to reshuffle perceptions instantly and decisively. That's a lot of characteristics on this really curvy figure, inspired by actresses like Mae West in the 1930s. With this trope of The Siren, the artists continue for more than 2 decades to produce The Marsh Girl, a hybrid of racialized sexuality, again white, here, of glamour and of working class credibility, that of a feminine ideal cultivated and presented for the pleasure of urban gazes. And she confronts them as much as she draws those gazes to her. As much as female subject matter of the 1930s was fueled by new social realities, such as women existing in the cityscape, both as occupant and as welcomed part of the urban spectacle, male subjects also negotiated changes that coincided with the perceived decline in the prominence of white masculinity. To return to Benton's comments, which I will return to Benton constantly, that's such a rich quote he had in the beginning. To return to his statements, the city had become querulous and touchy. So beautiful. Clearly the city had strayed, according to him, from investments in building buildings and tearing down buildings. These are acts of construction and destruction assigned routinely to men. Progress, action, agency, all were stalled. And men, as the agents responsible for urban culture's physical transformation, were now cast as ineffective. There is something to what Benton suggests. The visible testament to both this shift in sentiment about men being cast as ineffective and the overall impact of the era's social and economic circumstance on white masculinity was paramount. It was public-facing, and we can see it in the prominence of the breadline, the very infamous breadline. One cannot, the wealth of breadline images is almost crushing, and I could have had a whole talk with breadline images. There were so many, and they were so good. But that being said, you're going to see as many as I could jam into this talk. The Great Depression. This is how we get to the breadline. Few events of the 1930s would alter the ways in which urban bodies were pictured as much as the Great Depression, with nearly 100,000 Americans losing their jobs weekly between 1930 and 1932, and 1/4 of America's workforce unemployed by 1933. Unprecedented numbers of unemployed workers, as well as a broad spectrum of the middle class, of single women, of children, and the elderly flooded city streets. Urban spaces transformed into visible sites of public suffering, as seeing poverty became a pervasive urban reality. Relatedly, the breadline was, for urban residents, a sudden and unavoidable statement. Quote, "You turn a corner," reported the New Republic in 1932, "and here is a surprising spectacle. There was a line of men, 3 or sometimes 4 abreast, a block long, and wedged tightly together, so tightly that no passerby can break through," end quote. Newspaper photography, confirming the breadline as a potent contradiction of failure and heroicism, pictured uniform rows of disaffected and displaced figures cleaving their way across a stunted urban landscape. Tropes of previous class identities that designated blue or white-collared labor are necessarily absent in such images, as bodies appeared en masse and often from distant perspectives to encourage a quiet empathy from newspaper readers. Without compromising the anonymity and the authority of their gazes, audiences could negotiate interpretations of the images of the city's unfortunate and imprint them as a type of male urban figure. With the popular press incorporating the motif of the breadline to balance its dual roles as diligent witness and sympathetic responder to current events, urban realist painters, many of whom often borrowed iconography from print culture, responded similarly. And this work is in the exhibition. Marsh favored such tableaus of unemployed men as pictured in Breadline, No One Has Starved from 1932, in which here a line, but often in these work, lines of cloaked slump bodies garbed in trench coats and low-slung hats are pushed up against the picture plane. This etching's long horizontal stages their interminable struggle, their still bodies locked in perpetual stasis and the line unbreachable. Details of past and future, of individualism and progress disappear against Marcia's nondescript background, an implied cityscape with men who are present but in the past had been rarely truly seen. That the mass bodies pictured in such images were predominantly male and white, again, gender and race coming to the forefront, and being male and being white being inherent markers of social privilege. These mass bodies embedded in the minds of viewers the primacy and severity of the crisis of the Depression. Importantly, the scene has the potential, and this is what makes these Breadlines images so interesting, the scene has the potential to read both as a moment of intra-racial interaction and suffering and as an image of economic hardship in New York. Here, the figures' serviceable trench coats and tattered caps appear as the last vestiges of a white masculinity that is in certain peril. With the Breadline, the circumstances of the Depression gave way to new and prolific signs for white masculinity and its relationship to white labor. So anytime we are confronted with an image of a bum or a transient in this period, we should be looking for commentary about gender and race. This was not the case, however, for the visualization of Black bodies in the Depression era, whose presence on the cityscape was equally prevalent. Demographically, Blacks were disproportionately represented among the city's diverse jobless population. In 1933, the African American journal Opportunity reported that all levels of Black society were forced to search for viable employment. Jobless African Americans from, quote, white-collar men, men in overalls, coatless men, to men with college degrees, end quote, began to appear more frequently in public spaces around the city and throughout northern and southern metropolitan centers. They can, quote, be seen clustered here and there about the corners, end quote, the journal continued, stuck, no money, no jobs. Yet this heightened visibility in reality of unemployed African Americans did not spur a national response. Rather, it led to further pictorial and political marginalization. There was no room for them in the country's plans for economic and cultural rehabilitation, as the young cartoonist and future painter Romer Bearden acknowledged in his 1935 cartoon for The Crisis. With the rest of America, and white America here, with the rest of America marching along together towards prosperity, African American men and their families appear perched on a lonely hilltop, isolated from federal relief. For many, this pictured what was happening in the new reality for African Americans. Perhaps not surprisingly, then, othered bodies were left to operate within politically and pictorial, narrow discursive spaces, spaces that needed to be routinely renegotiated. African American artists who invested in claiming a new urban body responded by resisting certain types of representations, particularly representation of work or picturing a working class. It is as if the artists of the new Negro movement, also known as the Harlem Renaissance, could ward off the specter of economic trauma. Through the concerted presentation of performed identities, urban Black bodies pose as modern racial motifs, thus laying claim to their own reinvention. Gone are traditional and wholly restrictive representational systems adopted by dominant culture that deployed stereotype to define and predetermine urban Black bodies. In its place are independent, composed African-American figures. And by composed, I mean both in bearing and in artistic composition. As in James Van der Zee imagery, as we see here, in which a crisp photographic style is employed, here used to showcase my favorite image, raccoon coats in a gleaming automobile. Raccoon coats need to come back. Black economic mobility is placed assertively on display. So too does a representation of African American bodies that navigate bustling sidewalks or congregate at popular night spots. So too do they make an appearance in this time period. The sepia brown and deep tan figures that mingle in Archibald Motley Jr.'s vision of Chicago's South Side neighborhood known as Bronzeville or the Black Belt both occupy and designate a racialized landscape or urban space. Their brown bodies mark for viewers this region of the city that housed over 70% of Chicago's African Americans and resembled Harlem and Harlem's dominant Black population. Motley's attraction to working-class leisure led him to the South Side, and paintings of the cacophony of Black urban life, all the while avoiding blatant political commentary, and that includes Black poverty. Motley's nightclub scenes, like Van der Zee's photographs, do more than signal social ascendancy with their pictorial clarity and vibrant palettes. Within such settings, the bodies operate as a celebration of, and we got to turn the page here, it would cut right there, a celebration of African American urbanism that in turn act as advertisements, if you will, for accessible Black city spaces. Black city spaces to be enjoyed by whites, and that could lead to interracial interactions. So these works are doing double work. They're celebrating Black urban culture, but they're also suggesting that this is a place amenable to white visitors. Whether in Bronzeville or in Harlem, such endeavors, which I describe as slumming or looking across race and class for pleasure, corroborated that popular Black urban neighborhoods had arrived as new epicenters of urban pleasure. The allure of Black bodies on display and delighting in the city's dominating slumming fantasies were paramount. For those who sought public and informal recreation, with a hint of the exotic, Harlem was, for example, billed as newly accessible by the subway, sounds like an advertiser, amenable to diverse visitors and catering to the needs of the white urban tourist. In these circumstances, discourses of poverty or suffering or trauma did not exist. The popular press advertised, and here we got actual words, downtowners like Harlem joints. Because, quote, from midnight until dawn, they are a seething cauldron of Nubian mirth and hilarity. Woo! In 1931, the magazine Vanity Fair offered an even more colorful description of the neighborhood's primitive inclinations. This is one of my favorite quotes. Quote, Harlem, with its animal humors, its thick-lipped laughter, its highlights on ebony, is the mammy of the night world, nursing at her breast the jaded appetites of social registries and Broadwayites alike. Oh, so much there. Oh, you gotta shudder. It's just so deep. Paintings, but we're gonna keep moving. Paintings corralled African-American figures into nightclubs and dance halls, interior spaces that both celebrated and contained. Here, there is a direct conflation of geography and race and social progress. Simultaneously defined by and integral to the contemporary city, urban Black bodies function to delineate zones of cultural difference. They actually tell us where to go, where brownness, where Blackness is allowed and can flourish, all the while demonstrating and enacting what it meant to be urban. Of course, whatever manner by which poverty and suffering was avoided to craft representations of Black bodies, it is important to note that African-American figures, the African-American figure was not a monolithic sign. And they're actually incredibly dense and incredibly rich based on the context in which they're pictured. The language for picturing Black bodies, the pictorial parameters for these figures, was often calibrated, just like with white figures, along gendered lines and quite differently. This took many forms, and they were contingent on popular perception and the level of investment by artists and others in rewriting such language. In the representation of African American women, this meant separating the Black female body, often, from discourses of labor to help authenticate a gendered identity. After all, Black women had been positioned historically as laborers and breeders, coded as female when necessary, but rarely distinguished as appropriately feminine. Denied the same latitude as their white counterparts in expressing sexual freedoms championed within contemporary popular culture, urban Black women found they needed to stave off attacks on their morality that described them as impure and licentious, regardless of their social position. And so you get an outpouring of images such as this. With dominant culture defining all colored women, urban and rural, as negresses, to accommodate a degree of refinement in Black women would mean that one would need to confront inconsistent and prevailing sexual characterizations. After all, as sociologists of the 30s remarked, quote, the integrity of Black womanhood was always open to question. For artists seeking to counteract such depictions of Black female bodies, this meant the reconstruction of the corporeal form, thus transforming objectified bodies into subjective, if not admirable, personas, a maneuver dictated by medium and achieved through aesthetic technique. Unlike popular media, pictorial refinement was adopted as a vehicle to describe an appropriately deployed social independence that further elevated perceptions of urban African Americans. In early imagery by Motley, and I know I'm extending just a little bit before the 1930s marker in my talk, but these works by Motley are just absolutely incredible. In early imagery by Motley and the 1930s work by sculptor Sergeant Johnson, and then, of course, we have Charles Alston here in mid-decade. The emotive properties of color and a simplicity of form expanded a visual vocabulary that moved away from physical over-sexualization, over-representation, as well as moral and intellectual denigration. If the language of Black stereotype emphasized the size and color of the female body to determine cultural position and hierarchical boundaries, then the purity of color, the tightness of line and form, established a pictorial dignity for Black women, even if it meant an almost restrictive presentation of modesty, beauty, and virtue. Certainly, the symbolic weight of the Black female body was calibrated differently than Black men of the 1930s, but her body also signaled a distinct set of cultural dilemmas about race, about gender, and class. Black women served as a metaphor for a host of contests occurring in northern cities. Poor relations between Black and white middle class, the Black and white middle class, employment difficulties of Black men, the failure of the African American family, and fundamental anxieties about race mixing were all attributed to her physical presence. As described by the scholar Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, no relation, reputable Black women were caught in a, quote, politics of respectability, end quote, that required them to remain invisible in Harlem's geographic and discursive spaces, away from urban gazes. For them and their bodies and the desire to recoup Black female respectability, the space of the street was a working class site that necessitated the repositioning of their visibility and invisibility. There was always that maneuvering and negotiation with Black bodies. Black women do not appear on the breadline in this period. Black women do not truly appear to labor or to work, at least not in the fine art of painting. If they do emerge in city scenes, they are often merely local color. The range of representations of Black urban males also narrowed considerably in the Depression era. Black male bodies were often relegated to the categories of performer, laborer, or indigent, as they had for decades, and a range of urban artists fostered those roles. It would be the spectacles featured in vaudeville and minstrel performance that presented the Black male body on, this is a total pun, on a larger stage, so to speak, requiring the city's audiences to invest in popular conceptions of urban Blackness without necessarily, again, like with the Black female body, delineating class, education, or employment status. Meanwhile, in visual discourse about working African Americans, gestures to Black male agency, remember that's a key component of Depression-era imagery, particularly for white masculinity, gestures to Black male agency, as well as physicality in the early 1930s, suggest that the Black body best functioned outside of the city, the Black male body, as a noble agrarian whose labor was identified with the landscape, a landscape more readily than urban industry. And this is an important point of contrast, the city and urban industry from agrarian culture. I love to beat up on Thomas Hart Benton. I swear I'm going to write a book about him one day, so we're going to go after Benton a little bit. A number of works by Thomas Hart Benton, the noted regionalist and chauvinist, for example, relied on romantic visions of Black men engaged in agricultural production, despite his pictorial acknowledgement that Blacks worked in urban centers. He has a few images where he shows Black bodies in the city, key to the city. Even in his New School panel from 1930, as we see here, the panel titled Deep South, he borrows themes from Southern antebellum imagery of the 1840s and bucolic Reconstruction era scenes from the 1870s that were decidedly rural. In Benton's work, much like the range of government-sponsored photography during the Depression, Black bodies remained tied to the land to which they were assigned amid the crops they were expected to tend. Signs of pictorial fecundity in paintings and photographs of bright tufts of white cotton and ripened crops pictured in pastoral backgrounds beg for someone, or more specifically, some body to harvest them. One could argue this allowed an opportunity for the urban landscape to be reclaimed by white male bodies, to assert a visual prominence that seemingly was in decline. No competition. The presentation of the urban Black male as agrarian also was partnered with the urban Black male body as vagrant, creating another way, another manner to elevate masculinity and whiteness. The public exposure of the city's unemployed challenged wishful notions of vagrants that lingered throughout the decade. After all, vagrants had a history, and we get vagrants, bums, Bowery bums. Vagrants had a history of being cast as whimsical figures that rejected the country's moralization of work that structured much of middle-class life. They were, in some ways, heroes in the urban scape. They were the social loners that embraced a non-materialistic lifestyle. Instead, they were freed from the onerous constraints of domestic life, of industry and class maintenance, and could enjoy the city. Yet the circumstances of the Depression, as the circumstances worsened and expanded in scope, the figure of the unemployed man came to symbolize either economic victimization or inherent laziness, with little room for other characterizations. In this bifurcation, white male vagrants were elevated as victims, and black male vagrants were frequently debased as ineffectual socially, culturally, and economically. Indeed, black males were not and often did not function as signs of sympathetic masculinity. And as black bodies, they were used habitually to, as I mentioned before, demarcate city spaces. Remember, this is a key function. So when we do see black males, they appeared in shoddy neighborhoods, on vacant street corners, either lazing about or looking decidedly disreputable. The work Belmont Hotel features an assorted group arranged along a shadowy city street, loitering before a dilapidated building that was known infamously as a Bowery flophouse. It's not a hotel, it's a flophouse. New York's Bowery district was famed for both hosting the worst of male working class and poor individuals, and also for being riddled with a range of social outsiders. Presented in an urban setting such as this, the black body is rendered inactive and unproductive. The same is featured in Philip Evergood's painting, Spring. Despite Evergood's broad investments in social consciousness, and he walks the line between being a realist and a modernist painter, but pushes more towards sort of a socially invested realism. Despite his investments in social consciousness and his pictorial departure to present vagrancy in a modern representational style, leaning towards abstraction, there is little redeeming about his black figures here in Spring, who lounge in an industrial landscape, notable in the background, a General Electric factory, and underneath an automobile overpass. Now, vagrant-savvy eyes were hardly surprised by the black figures pictured in these works. They expected dank, closed-in passageways with black male figures, enhanced by deep shadows and grim palettes. Indeed, the motley collection of figures of Marcia's tattoo and a haircut and Raphael Sawyer's Bowery vignettes, and there's a whole slew of them, express the fallout of the Depression, the sullen resolve and murky prospects of the neighborhood's transient population. However, the crowd's expression of, and here the group here, expression of collective I made up a word here, collective suffering and being of a reputable sort is rendered complex because of race and the urban environment. Because white urban masculinity had been battered and the black male body already functioned properly as a sign of social and cultural inferiority. A supposed inherent, again, laziness, that word comes back up again, and lack of civic responsibility comfortably aligned African-American men already the irredeemable vagrant and saw them as being unworthy. And the Bowery's hosting of the city's low and seating elements of society meant that urban African Americans were expected, the men, to be hovering in its dark corners, pictured as if born to a morally barren landscape. So much representation in the 1930s. If we return to Benton's commentary from the beginning of this talk, the artist's statement about the city's lack of masculinity is not without merit, as I suggested. If we acknowledge the broader response to cultural and social and even aesthetic change, new bodies were challenging not only in how the city functioned, but also in as much as how it looked. Everything was being disrupted. In addition to the hundreds of thousands of residents that filled city streets, the subway stations, the street corners, the boardwalks, the popular public spaces around New York, around Detroit, around so many places, they now had to accommodate the poor and the homeless in the 1930s. The urban masculinity that Benton mourns has become visual reality, one that affected the processes of vision or seeing, often privileging a man's right to look and his ability to be looked at. Something that a man, a white urban male figure, a white male urban artist, a white male urban resident, could no longer completely control. As my final comment for this evening, I must concede that maybe, even though I have issues with Thomas R. Benton, I could spend hours talking about him. Maybe he was right. Maybe. The city of the 1930s, in the face of significant social and economic circumstance, may have become somewhat feeble and querulous and touchy. I'll grant him that. But it also reflected a dynamism born of transformation and evolution, change that expanded who was looking and who was being looked at, and a growth in the numbers and types of those in the city that required a recalibration. We have seen this in this talk this evening. For those such as Benton, this recalibration resulted in him seeing a loss or a weakness of a masculine ideal of the city. But for others, what resulted was a new way of seeing and representing, a broader scope, a view beyond to push forward the vibrancy and the change of the city. Thank you.